Welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to Chapter 4 of All Quiet on the Western Front. And the war is picking up a little bit, or at least it is for how the novel's going. The chapter starts with the company heading out to put up some barbed wire on the front. The trip starts out relatively quiet. The lorries are on, the trucks, as I'll be calling them, are very packed full, and they're all packed together. Though as they head past a farmhouse in the area, both Paul and Kat hear some geese inside, and Kat makes sure to note where they actually are. Food, what you gonna do? They reach the artillery line and disembark from the trucks. While they're there, they're actually listening to the guns up at the front and notice some things are off. The British seem to be firing a little earlier than expected, and Kat is relatively sure that there will be a bombardment that night. What can you do except follow orders? So they start marching out to the front to go ahead and get their barbed wire out there. On the trip, Paul takes some time to reminisce about how the front changes men from more thinking animals to human animals, aka instinct becomes more important than actually thinking things through. They finally do deploy all of their barbed wire and get their job done, and then try and get some sleep because the trucks aren't due to be back for a while. Well, Paul wakes up at an odd point, startled by how close some of the gunfire is, and hey, probably a good thing that he woke up because a bombardment does start happening. Paul helps out a recruit, or at least tries to, and eventually just lets the man hide in his side, and he's even kind enough to the kid afterwards to tell him, no harm in being gun shy, go ahead and just clean yourself up in the woods, and we'll head back to the trucks. They start heading that way when Kat starts getting a little iffy about things. He's feeling sketched out, and it's enough warning that another bombardment is actually about to hit, and the company takes cover in the only cover they have, a rural graveyard. Everything goes crazy from there as Paul recognizes bits and pieces of things. The graveyard getting blown to bits, him successfully not getting blown to bits, gas being deployed, Kat saving him and allowing him to get his gas mask on, him helping a recruit get his gas mask, and then taking cover in a shellfire hole with 3 other men. Well, until one of them gets hit, and then Kat and Paul help rescue the man and get him out from under a coffin that's pinned him, and then when the gas attack ends, are successfully able to get him out of the hole entirely. Unfortunately, Kat and Paul run into the recruit from before, who has basically an exploded hip joint and will never walk again in his life. He's also been hit in his right arm, and Paul and Kat discuss whether or not they should put him out of his misery before medics arrive, and they can't do anything more than get a stretcher for the kid. Then they hop on the trucks and head home. There is nothing else that they can do. And of course, home, I say here, like Kat says home, is back to where they've been bunking for the last little bit. Yeah. What I find particularly interesting about how the book itself starts is we have chapter 1 where we actually find a peaceful moment after something catastrophic has happened. And so for chapter 1, 2, and 3, we actually have a slower story where we're seeing the aftermath of something that we haven't perceived. And then all of a sudden chapter 4 comes along and bam, a bunch of things are happening and it's all over the place. And I think the book does a really good job of portraying the sudden madness and sound and fury that a war probably really is for the soldiers fighting it. So you have these quiet moments and quiet moments and quiet moments, and suddenly that's not happening anymore. Everything is just explosions and bombardment and gas, and you don't really know what's going on. You're just trying to deal with it as much as you can. And the book does a good job of doing this, both with Paul's thinking as he's reminiscing, and Paul's thinking as action is happening. So how the book itself is actually written. Because when that second bombardment in the graveyard starts, it really is sort of this disconcerting mashup of things that are happening. You're not clearly figuring things out, but that's precisely what Paul is going through. He doesn't have enough time to figure things out in detail. He's been hit by something. He checks if he's okay. He's hit by something else, but it's fine, so he's still checking where he's been hit the first time. There's a shell hole in front of him. They don't normally land in the same place twice. He's going to try and get there. Something stops him. He realizes it's a coffin with a body. He digs down to avoid further bombardment. Somebody's shaking him. He tries to shake them off. They're shaking him harder. It's Kat. He can't hear the man who's screaming at him. He realizes he is implying gas. He gets his gas mask on. They're running for the hole. He trips over a recruit. He tries to get the recruit's attention, shoves the recruit's gas mask at him, gets in the hole. Like, it's this real, honest to God, just rapid fire, boom, 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 that's not always making sense, but it's a bombardment of writing to mimic a bombardment of the actual war itself. Like, Paul doesn't have time to think straight here because there are shells falling on top of him. Things are blowing up. He's being hit by shrapnel. He's checking to make sure he hasn't been hit by full shrapnel. He almost passes out. He stops himself. He realizes that that's not a good thing, but he can't think it through. He doesn't know why he felt the way he did. He is effectively just trying to survive this moment by thinking as rapidly as he can and doing what his instincts are telling him to do. And all of that is set up previously in this chapter as they come to the front, and Paul is actually thinking about how the front changes human beings into instinctual animals. You don't think about hitting the deck. You don't consciously realize that there was a shell coming and that I'm going to throw myself down to avoid harm. Just your senses perceive it and you hit the ground. Your brain is not catching up here. You need to trust your body. And so he is actually thinking about this as he goes forward. Trust your body, and also about trusting the earth underneath you. The earth becomes your best friend. It becomes your brother. It becomes your mother. You bury yourself in the earth for protection. So all of this thought process that he has earlier just gets completely washed away as the bombardment actually happens, and you see in the text itself him responding as he said people responded. So it's not him standing there and saying, this is what happens to other lesser men. No, it's literally how you respond under fire. You're just going for it. You are trying to just survive. You get in the earth. You crawl under that coffin if it gives you some cover. You head into that, like, shell hole. You put your gas mask on. You deal with, like, the pain and the suffering. And you help other people deal with it. Because when they have this moment of this man getting hit in the hole, his first, like, panicked thought is to take the gas mask off. So, like, immediately Comte has to grab the man's hand and twist it away. Because once pain is involved, you're not thinking straight in a different way. You can't think of the right thing to do while your brain is going absolutely haywire. So we're seeing these different levels of not thinking and how they're actually, like, good for somebody or bad for somebody. So the instinctual not thinking is good. It tends to save lives. But the pain-induced not thinking really, like, just gets you in more trouble. And that's why when you go into war, you don't go into war by yourself. You go in with groups of people. Because the hope is somebody is going to be there, like Comte was, to grab your hand and prevent you from, like, effectively killing yourself by tearing off your gas mask. But it also, he is here to sort of display how terrible this war actually is. And the use of the graveyard here, I think, is really useful, because it's not just these men. And the horses, I think, are like the pinnacle of this. But the graveyard speaks to how widespread the war of destruction actually is. Like, Enric uses the description, they got killed again. But Paul recognizes every time they got hit, one of the living people were saved. But that's not the sacrifice they're thinking about when it comes to the horses. The horses suffering here, so they've gotten, their unit that the horses were a part of got bombarded extremely hard, and these horses are wounded. And Enrique is not backing away from this. He is describing different injuries in depth. If the horse has been gutted, if its back has been broken, what is happening here. All of it is being described, because it should be noted that war novels are usually precisely anti-war novels. They are here to tell you how terrible this thing actually is, and how much you want to prevent it in the future. And that's why he starts the novel with, this is not an adventure, we're not happy fun times, let's go kill some Nazis or something. No, this is the First World War. People suffered, they died, and it was not just limited to bad guys suffering. So the use of the graveyard here is very useful, because those people had nothing to do with this, and their graves are being desecrated by bombs and by men trying to survive. And then the horses are also another innocent being. If you've seen the show MASH, the clip that sticks out in my head as I read this was a discussion in the operation. A gentleman says war is hell, and one of the other doctors says it's not, and he turns to the priest that they have at the camp and says, Father, who goes to hell? And that's the sinners. Well, war affects everybody, the saints, the sinners, the completely innocent ones. So war is so much worse than hell in that way. And that's being painted here, because no matter how you feel about the people we've met, the horses screaming and moaning and dying affects even these sort of hard-won soldiers. So you really should get a sense that, like, if they're really messed up by this sound, you would probably vomit. Like, you would roll over and vomit and cry. It's not something you ever want to hear, and it's not something you ever want any animal to suffer. Well, then you meet the recruits, the little kids who shouldn't be out here, and you start feeling that way with them as well. You don't think the dead should have their resting place blown to bits, and you also don't think any of these soldiers should be out here. It doesn't matter if Cat is like 40. This is a messed up place. He's affected by it. We're actually told that. He's skittish and jumpy, and he doesn't want to be here. So, as much as Paul says that the emotions and the thought process tend to shut off when you're on the front, and you become sort of this stouter, in-control person, that's precisely not true. You have no control here. That's another story that Paul is telling himself while he's trying to deal with the fact that they're in a situation that is going to wreck them. And people are deeply affected by the horses dying, by the little kids dying. Kat and he have a conversation about whether or not they should kill this recruit, because he's probably just going to die in pain. But they recognize that once the doctors show up, that's not a move they can make. They can only do that if they're the only ones there, because morally it's still not accepted by the society, even if everyone in that situation could and did consent. So even if that kid did turn over and say, I don't want to live like this, help me. Well, that's a big issue we still have with society, assisted suicide, and whether or not that has a place anyplace. Well, with just so much suffering that's happened in this chapter, we need to recognize why Kat and Paul are thinking this way. They've just seen so many people who might have survived the war but have been absolutely wrecked by it at this point, who can't walk away. And they probably just hear the screaming of these horses in their head, the innocent who shouldn't be here. And none of them should be here. This is precisely, like Eric says at the beginning, a book about men who might have survived the war and bombs, but were absolutely, totally destroyed by them. And we start getting that here at chapter 4. Because the prior ones, for the most part, aren't directly affecting our people. It's a lot of reminiscing about when they were in drill and when they were training. And there is some death, but it's more on the fringes. Even Kimmerich, we never had a chance to really meet. So we don't always think about how much he and Paul knew each other and how much that meant. And then suddenly there's this absolute mess of a chapter with death and destruction and the screaming of horses and the dying of innocent men. And that's sort of when you realize precisely where you are in a novel like this and precisely what it is doing to these people. Because you think Kat has it together. And then you start seeing, in these moments of calm between absolute terrible circumstances, how much he's just barely holding himself together, and what little bomb can shake any of these men to pieces. And I don't think we can blame them. You certainly never can until you've been, I think, in that position, or something like it. But it does sort of freak you out, because should they have even contemplating killing that man without his consent? Is this the right way their brain should be functioning? And what happens when they're no longer in a war situation and they have to walk back among common folks? And can we even get there? This is a real chaotic bombardment of a chapter, and it's precisely here to wake you up to the horrors in a very visceral way, with those horses and that recruit and Paul and his friends just trying to survive. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.